Hello, everybody. It's so good to beam into this climate festival and hear from so many people who are taking courageous and positive actions for the future of this planet. And while I wish I could be there in person and see your faces, I take heart digitally from all the efforts you're making to stop the climate crisis. That being said, we're gathering at a really difficult moment in world history. I don't need to tell anybody about that, but we're facing a climate crisis inside of a pandemic. And in the United States and elsewhere, we're also dealing with democracy crises, where so-called leaders are turning their backs on the people they're supposed to represent. And all over the world, Black people and people of color are rising up to demand that their lives and their existence matter. So there's a lot going on, and we know that the climate crisis is connected to all these other issues. But when we start to truly witness these connections, when we remember that people of color experience environmental racism on top of the climate crisis, or that deforestation destroys animal habitat and increases the likelihood of new pandemics, or when we see that corporate-backed politicians care more about their donors than the future of this planet, it can become really overwhelming. And it can become even harder to believe in our own power. And that's what I want to talk to you all about today: how to navigate the difficult feelings that come up in the face of the climate crisis and how to reclaim our power to act for good. I believe that we're here at this festival because we all have probably at some moment in our lives had what I call an environmental awakening, a moment when we realize that the way that we treat the earth and all of its creatures is destructive, or a moment where we realized that climate change posed an existential threat to the future of this planet. My environmental awakening happened in 2009 after the Copenhagen Climate Accords. I was working as a climate organizer at the time in my home state of Utah, and the IPCC had just released a report saying that we were reaching a climate tipping point. So Copenhagen was our last real chance to stop the disaster before it truly started. And so I watched the proceedings with bated breath, hoping that the leaders would do the right thing and turn the ship around. Instead, the climate talks broke down and leaders chose profits and the economy over a livable planet. After that, I felt so much despair and I felt so much anger. I kept organizing because I knew that we needed bold, creative, strategic action that came from the grassroots to actually tackle this issue. But I was racked with more and more feelings of anxiety and dread. I want you to think about your own environmental awakening right now, what prompted it and what it inspired you to do. But I also want you to remember what it felt like. Did you feel grief or cynicism? Did you feel loneliness, despair, hope? I ask because the great environmental writer Aldo Leopold said that the consequence of an ecological awakening was to live alone in a world of wounds. And it can really feel like that some days, right? After we confront what we are doing to the environment, it's hard to go back to normal. Instead, we wake up each day and have to face the reality that we have a decade, 1 decade, to stop runaway climate change. We have to wake up to headlines about wildfires so powerful that they raise entire communities to the ground and send smoke across entire continents. We have to confront the fact that 1 million species are hovering on the verge of extinction. We have to witness superstorms and floods and crop failures and watch as indigenous communities battle pipelines and poor communities battle oil refineries and climate refugees flee the only homes they've ever known. And we have to face that the world as we know it, as we thought it would be, is over. And we have to build a new one from what we've got lying around. And in this world, sometimes it feels like having a heart is a liability. I don't know if you feel that way, but I definitely do. It can feel like we live alone in a world of wounds. But actually, if you're feeling overwhelmed or upset or sad or concerned, you're not alone. In a recent survey of 2,000 British participants, 74% said they felt climate anxiety. And among 18 to 24-year-olds, 51% said that they felt they weren't doing enough to be sustainable. As the devastating consequences of climate change increase, people everywhere are fearing for the places, land, and people they love, and for the future of the planet. And as we wake up to that reality, many psychiatrists and therapists are trying to tell us that the climate crisis is also a mental health crisis, something that can lead to depression, anxiety, and even spikes in suicidality. And they're coming up with names for these experiences. Some call the fear of ecological disaster eco-anxiety, or a state of distress about the environment. Eco-anxiety can look like fleeting feelings of worry, it can look like avoidance, or it can look like a manic state of constant action. As eco-anxiety expert Britt Ray says, it can also affect your personal relationships, your ability to sleep or to work, and the decisions you make, like whether or not to have a child or if you should move. So it's a really big deal. Others have different names for this phenomenon. The Australian environmental philosopher and activist Glenn Albrecht invented a term for ecological grief after seeing the effects that open pit mining had on the people of New South Wales. The mines made these people physically sick, but he found out they also made them emotionally sick. The loss of their beloved land caused them serious emotional distress and interfered with their ability to function. Albrecht called this feeling solastalgia. It's an update on the word nostalgia, and it describes the distress people feel when they see their home or the place they love changed in front of their eyes by the forces of environmental destruction. Another word was coined by Lise von Sesteren, a psychiatrist and climate activist, who came up with her own term after seeing her patients exhibit symptoms of trauma because of the state of the world. Von Sesteren experienced these feelings herself. She had nightmares, she obsessed over the news, she felt panic and dread, and she recognized these symptoms as symptoms of what we would normally call PTSD. But von Sesteren and her patients weren't experiencing a concrete trauma that had already happened. They were experiencing fear about a future global crisis that in many ways hadn't affected them personally. So von Sesteren called this overwhelming fear of the future pre-TSD. So many feelings are coming up around the climate crisis that two artists, Alicia Escott and Heidi Quandt, are even creating a crowdsourced dictionary for the Anthropocene. It's a book of new words that describes how it feels to live in this chaotic and painful time, where the world as we know it is changing irrevocably. Escott and Quandt work with regular people to describe feelings that arise with the climate crisis. They've created a word called nanapura, which is the desire to have children or grandchildren, but fearing for the world that they will inherit. There's another word called psychic corpus dissonance, which is the feeling of being glad for warm weather in the winter, but then getting freaked out because you realize what warm weather means in winter. And they've also created a word that is very suitable for this year. It's called broken record breaking, or the feeling that yesterday's record of COVID cases or temperature or fires and hurricanes is constantly getting one-upped by the next day's record. And so I bring up all this because I want you to think of these words for a second. Do you relate to any of them in particular? And does it help, if you do, to have a name for what you're feeling? And if you had to create a word for how it feels to be alive right now, fighting for a better world in the midst of the climate crisis, what would it be? Mine is eco-pooper, which is a party pooper who talks about climate change at social functions and bums everybody out. But the purpose of these new terms is not to suggest that these feelings are pathological. In fact, feeling fear and grief and anger over the state of the planet is a perfectly reasonable response to what we see happening all around us. So these words don't exist to stigmatize the people who feel them, but as a way of pointing out that the world itself is sick, that this is a reaction to a sick world. The therapist Gary Greenberg says that calling something a sickness doesn't mean there's something wrong with the person experiencing it. Instead, it's a way to make your experience real, to name it, and to get access to the resources to heal. Glenn Albrecht, the guy we talked about earlier who created solastalgia, calls eco-anxiety a dis-ease rather than a disease, a state of being ill at ease with what's happening to the planet. So, okay, why are these words important? Why does it matter to talk about climate grief? The climate fight is urgent, you might say. Shouldn't we just put our emotions aside and focus on stopping carbon emissions? Well, the short answer is no. First, because ignoring our emotions isn't working. We've known about climate change for decades now, and for decades, climate scientists have told us that if we keep emitting carbon, the planet will become uninhabitable. So you think that would be motivating to people, but year after year, carbon emissions have gone up. And while many people have been inspired by the science to fight for a livable future, others haven't. And a huge percentage of people even flat out deny that it's happening. So what's going on here? Why doesn't objective information inspire people to action? One reason is that the climate crisis is a psychological crisis. meaning that climate change is so terrifying that many people feel like they can't face it and retreat into apathy, cynicism, or denial. And even when people who care deeply about solving the crisis, like all of you do, it can be easy to get bogged down with overwhelm and burnout or checkout. As the poet T.S. Eliot says, humankind cannot bear very much reality. For decades, we as activists have responded to what we call apathy by giving people more information. We cite facts and figures and show people graphs and hope they will take action, but not enough do. And don't get me wrong, climate science is invaluable. It can give us information about what is happening and the scope of the problem. But climate change isn't just about facts. It's also about our response to those facts. And those responses include deep and difficult emotions that can be scary to process at all, let alone on our own. So if we want people to take action, or if we want to revive our own commitment to taking action, we need ways to name and process the emotions that come up when we face climate reality. Because if we don't process these emotions, they won't go away. They will simply morph into defense mechanisms. And that can look like dissociating from reality and distracting ourselves, or it can look like, maybe for the folks at this festival, going into soft denial or disavowal, where we recognize that climate change exists and is a threat, but act in many ways as if that's not actually true. Or it can look like becoming bitter, jaded, and overwhelmed. So we need to reframe how we see ourselves and each other in the fight for climate justice. Maybe our anxiety about the state of the world is not a defect, it's a message, a reminder that we care. And maybe other people's inaction is not apathy. Maybe, as environmental activist and writer Joanna Macy says, apathy is the mask of suffering, a defense that people put up when they are distressed but feel powerless to act. So what do we do about eco-anxiety? How do we respond if we, as Leopold said, feel like we're living alone in a world of wounds? That's what a growing movement of activists, teachers, and therapists are trying to answer. And one of the most important answers goes against what Leopold says. Don't do it alone. Don't live in a world of wounds by yourself. One climate therapist, Andrew Bryant, encourages people experiencing climate anxiety to take 4 steps. 1, feel it. 2, talk about it. 3, unite with others. And 4, act. And repeat. The first step, feeling, involves mindfulness. When you feel distressing emotions about the environment arise, get into your body and track the feelings without judgment. Just let them grow and subside. I find it helpful personally to create a container for this grief so I don't feel like it's going to take over my life. So for a long time, I would meditate on the climate for 10 minutes every morning. I would let thoughts arise on their own, or I would think about a specific animal threatened with extinction, or a person or a landscape I loved. Then I would let myself experience whatever emotions came up. At the end, I usually offered thanks for the person or animal or landscape that I cherished, or I made a small promise to do something to make the world better for them. And doing that helped me process what would otherwise become a sort of growing, uncontrollable, paralyzing anxiety. It also helps to create rituals around climate grief. In our world right now, we have a lot of rituals for personal loss. When someone dies, we have a funeral. When someone gets sick, we bring them food. But when the loss is global and the reality is so bleak, we don't have a lot on tap for people. So it's even more important to create our own rituals. A climate ritual can look like so many different things. It could involve learning the names of trees and plants. It could look like meditating in a beautiful place. It could look like planting flowers or putting out birdseed. Or it could look like a funeral for animals or the humans and landscapes that we have lost. The second step is to talk about it. Living with climate disaster may be like living in a world of wounds, but we don't have to be alone in it. Because luckily, there are more and more places where people can talk through their ecological grief. There are more and more therapists who are trained in what's called ecopsychology, an approach that defines sanity as acting as if the whole world matters, which I think is a pretty great definition. And there are also groups you can join or form to help process grief with your friends or fellow activists. You can start a climate cafe or climate circle. If you want to do that, check out the website Climate in Mind for more information. Or you can join what's known as a good grief group, where you can share and get support from others who feel like you do. Or you can just ask a friend if you could talk about climate grief with them. Chances are they feel that anxiety and grief too, and would also want a place to unpack the complicated feelings that come along with it. Finally, unite and act. It can feel overwhelming to fight climate change, but studies show that taking even small actions increase our sense that we are capable or powerful, or as psychologists say, they increase our feelings of self-efficacy. So this week, take one small action that is in line with your values and act out of an abundance of love and a desire for a better world rather than fear. Just try it out for just once. These actions, of course, won't stop climate change on their own, but they will put you in an alignment with your values and help you believe that you can do more. Speaking of which, the climate crisis does require more than just individual lifestyle change. It requires collective action. So join with others and take action on a bigger scale. That can look like joining a group. It can look like going to a march. It can look like lobbying your elected officials or engaging in civil disobedience. Just do something with others that increases the power you have to leverage the world that you want. Taking action should put you a little out of your comfort zone, and that's normal and can even be empowering. But your efforts will be most sustainable if they are rooted in what you love to do and what you do well. There's something called the social change ecosystem map that identifies different roles people can play in social movements. Are you a weaver, someone who connects people, places, and movements together? Or are you a disruptor, someone who takes risky actions that push the idea of what's possible? Maybe you're a builder, someone who organizes people for the long haul, developing strategic actions and building people power. The list goes on, but the point is this: find a way to help that will make you feel alive. There's one final thing we can do, and it's more emotional. We can realize that grief is actually what we feel when we lose what we most love. So much of the climate crisis brings up fear and anger and overwhelm. And those are all hugely important emotions. But the most helpful way to respond to grief is to act out of love. Love for what we have lost, love for the places and people and animals still left, and love for the world we want to build. As Britt Ray reminds us, mourning is a process that helps us understand how the world has changed after we've lost something precious to us. And then we relearn the world. Relearning means that we have processed how we are going to be in that world that's changed so much and to find our own meaning within it. I believe that as we face our feelings about the climate crisis, the emotions of anxiety and overwhelm and fear will still persist, but more and more often they will turn into feelings of love, commitment, and kinship with the whole world. I believe that we will also find meaning, personal and political, in building the world that we want. And I believe that's what it will actually take, not just to stop climate change, but to radically reimagine our relationships to each other, to the land, and other human beings. Thank you.